The air in the Kentucky backwoods of 1858 hung thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was an odor that clung to the clothes, filled the lungs, and promised secrets best left buried. Sheriff Brody knelt, his worn leather boots sinking into the soft mud near the creek bed. Before him lay a human arm, unnaturally pale, reaching from the earth as if in a final, desperate plea. A recent storm had clawed away the shallow grave's meager covering, revealing the horrifying truth it was meant to conceal forever. The limb was disturbingly well preserved, the skin waxy and taut, a stark contrast to the rot he'd expected. This was not the work of time or nature alone. Something profoundly unnatural had taken place here. His deputy, a young man named Calloway, retched behind a great oak, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. Brody ignored him. His focus was singular, his gaze locked on the macabre discovery. This was the third such grave found in as many weeks, all within a mile of the old Finch Tavern, a place locals called the Traveler's Rest. But no one had rested there for some time. The tavern stood silent now, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Rumors had always swirled around the isolated inn, whispers of travelers who checked in but never checked out. Stories of a curse, of vanishings that were easier to attribute to the treacherous wilderness than to the quiet, unsettling couple who ran the place. Brody had dismissed them as folklore, the ghost stories of superstitious settlers. But kneeling here, with the cold, waxy flesh of a forgotten soul practically touching his hand, he could no longer afford his skepticism. The stories were not just stories. They were echoes of a horrifying, methodical evil. The question was no longer if people had vanished from the Finch Tavern, but how many, and what truly macabre secret had been served to them alongside their final drink. The answer, he suspected, was far more disturbing than any local legend could have possibly conceived. The legend was just the beginning of a cold case that would forever stain the soil of this land. To understand the darkness that festered at the Traveler's Rest, we must turn the clock back 2 years to 1856. The American frontier was a place of brutal contrasts, of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving peril, of boundless opportunity and swift, anonymous death. Kentucky, a gateway to the untamed West, was a landscape carved by winding rivers and dense, ancient forests. Through these woods snaked treacherous trails, the arteries of a nation pushing ever westward. Travelers on these paths, prospectors chasing gold, families seeking new lives, merchants peddling their wares, were vulnerable, isolated, and often desperate for a safe haven to wait out a storm or rest their weary bones. It was on one such lonely path, miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, that the Finch Tavern stood. It wasn't much to look at, a 2-story structure of rough-hewn logs sagging under the weight of its own grim history. A plume of smoke perpetually curled from its stone chimney, a beacon of false hope in the wilderness. The tavern was owned and operated by Elias and Annalise Finch. Elias was a hulking, bearded man, his face a roadmap of hard years and harder whiskey. He was quiet, but his silence was heavy, watchful. Annalise, his wife, was his opposite. She was slight, almost spectral, moving through the tavern's gloom with a silent, unnerving grace. Her eyes, pale and deep-set, seemed to see more than they let on. They were a strange pair, their relationship a silent pact understood only by them. To the few locals who lived scattered in the surrounding hills, the Finches were recluses, best left alone. To travelers, they offered a warm fire, a stiff drink, and a soft bed, a trinity of temptations that, for an alarming number of guests, would prove to be a fatal trifecta. The tavern was a perfectly situated trap, a spider's web spun across the most vulnerable point in a traveler's journey. And the spiders were always watching, always waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble through their door, unaware that every drink served within those walls was a prelude to a horrifying, forbidden ritual. In the autumn of 1856, a man named Silas Kane pushed open the heavy oak door of the Traveler's Rest. He was a prospector, his clothes caked in the mud and grime of the mountains, but his eyes held the feverish glint of success. He slapped a heavy leather pouch onto the bar, the sound a dull, satisfying thud that cut through the tavern's quietude. Elias Finch, wiping down a pewter mug with a stained rag, barely looked up. "Whiskey," Silas boomed, his voice too loud for the small space. "And a room, been sleeping with rocks for a pillow for 2 months." He grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "But it was worth it," he added, patting the pouch. "Found a vein, pure as the driven snow." Elias' eyes, which had been half-closed, flickered toward the pouch. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift. From the shadows of the kitchen, Annalise emerged. She carried no lamp, yet she seemed to glide through the dim light, her long, dark dress blending with the deep shadows of the room. She placed a glass and a bottle before Silas without a word. Her movements were fluid, deliberate. Silas poured himself a generous measure, downing it in one go. "Another," he coughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Annalise refilled his glass, but this time, as she turned her back to him to retrieve something from a high shelf, her hand moved with a practiced, almost invisible swiftness. A small, dark vial, uncorked and then stoppered in a single, fluid motion. A few drops, colorless and odorless, swirled into the amber liquid. It was a poison of her own macabre design, a concoction brewed from the forbidden flora of the deep woods, wolfsbane and nightshade, mixed with a stabilizing touch of arsenic. It was a recipe for a slow, agonizing demise, one that mimicked the symptoms of the swamp fevers and dysentery that so often plagued travelers on the frontier. It was the perfect, untraceable murder weapon. Silas Kane took the second glass and drank deeply. He spoke of his plans, of the land he would buy, the life he would build. He was a man on the cusp of a dream, entirely unaware that his future had already been written, its final chapter composed in the bottom of the glass he now held. Elias listened, nodding occasionally, his expression a mask of disinterest that concealed a cold, predatory focus. Annalise had already retreated back into the kitchen's gloom, her part in the grim theater complete. As the night wore on, a warmth spread through Silas's belly, a pleasant, creeping heat that he mistook for the whiskey's embrace. But soon it soured. A subtle cramping began, a twisting knot deep in his gut. He excused himself, attributing it to the rich stew Annalise had served him. By dawn, the cramps had become a searing, white-hot agony. He was racked with violent shivers, his body slick with a cold, greasy sweat. He called out for help, his voice a hoarse croak, but only Elias appeared at his door. The big man looked down at the prospector writhing on the cot, his face a mixture of feigned concern and something else, something that looked chillingly like satisfaction. "Swamp fever," Elias grunted, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Got a bad case of it, friend. Seen it 100 times." Silas, delirious with pain, could only moan. He was trapped, isolated, his life bleeding away in a squalid room miles from anyone who could help him. His gold, the very thing that was meant to be his salvation, had become his death warrant. He had walked into the traveler's rest seeking shelter, and had found only a meticulously crafted and horrifyingly patient tomb. He would not see another sunrise. His name would simply be added to a silent, growing list of the vanished, another ghost to haunt the cursed woods of Kentucky. The legend of the poisoned tavern was not born in a single night, but built victim by victim, secret by secret. The disappearance of a lone prospector like Silas Kane was an unremarkable event on the frontier. Men vanished all the time. They fell to disease, to accidents, to the unforgiving wilderness. They were robbed by bandits or simply chose to disappear and start anew. There was rarely an investigation. A man was here one day and gone the next, a ghost swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. And so no one came looking for Silas. His story, if it was ever told, became just another cautionary tale about the dangers of the trail. The Finches knew this. They relied on it. Their business model was built upon the anonymity of their victims. They chose their targets with a chilling precision: lone travelers, those without immediate family expecting them, people whose absence wouldn't raise an alarm for weeks, if ever. After Silas Kane was dealt with, life at the tavern returned to its grim normalcy. His belongings were sorted, his gold pouch tucked away in a loose floorboard beneath Elias and Annalise's bed. His horse was sold at a market 2 counties over. It was a clean, efficient operation, honed by years of macabre practice. But with each disappearance, the whispers grew. Locals who lived in the sparsely populated hills and hollows began to notice the strange coincidences. A fine-looking mare being ridden by Elias, one that was identical to a horse owned by a merchant who had reportedly passed through weeks earlier. Analyze wearing a silver locket that bore a striking resemblance to one worn by a young woman who had stopped for directions and was never seen again. These were small things, easily dismissed on their own, but woven together, they began to form a disturbing tapestry of suspicion. The tavern started to earn a reputation. It became a place to be avoided after dark. Local folklore began to attach itself to the sagging log structure, painting it as a place of profound evil, a cursed ground where the veil between the living and the dead was perilously thin. They said you could hear voices on the wind near the property, the faint cries of the lost. They were right. The voices were there. They just weren't ghosts. Not yet. The dark reputation of the Traveler's Rest was a double-edged sword for the Finches. While it kept the prying eyes of locals at a distance, it also risked scaring away their true prey, the weary, unsuspecting traveler. But the American dream was a powerful lure, and for every person who heeded the warnings, there was another who, driven by exhaustion and desperation, saw the tavern's flickering lamplight as a sign of salvation. In the spring of 1857, that light drew in James and Eleanor Cartwright. They were newlyweds barely out of their teens, their faces etched with the hopeful optimism of youth. They were headed for Oregon, their wagon loaded with all their worldly possessions, and their hearts full of dreams of a new life on the fertile soil of the West. They were the perfect victims, young, trusting, and carrying a modest but tempting sum of money sewn into the lining of Eleanor's dress, their entire life savings. They arrived at dusk, just as a cold, driving rain began to fall. James, with his strong jaw and clear eyes, helped his wife down from the wagon. Eleanor, though weary from the journey, had a gentle beauty that seemed entirely out of place in the tavern's oppressive gloom. They were a beacon of light and life, and to the Finches they looked like lambs to the slaughter. Elias greeted them with his usual gruff hospitality, while Analyze, a silent specter, showed them to a room upstairs. The room was sparse but clean enough. From their window they could see their wagon and their two sturdy horses, their only connection to the life they were leaving behind and the one they hoped to build. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. The woman, Analyze, hadn't said a single word. She just pointed to the room and glided away. "It's just for one night," James reassured her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Tomorrow, we'll be back on our way." It was a promise made with love, a promise he would be tragically unable to keep. For Analyze was already downstairs, preparing their final meal, her hands moving with that same, horrifyingly familiar and practiced grace. Downstairs in the common room, the Finches served the Cartwrights a hot meal of venison stew and cornbread. The young couple, starved after a long day on the trail, ate ravenously. They spoke to Elias about their plans, their voices filled with the earnest excitement of their new adventure. They spoke of the farm they would build, the children they would raise. Elias just grunted in response, his eyes betraying nothing. Analyze moved in and out of the kitchen, her presence a constant, silent weight in the room. She offered them cider, a specialty of the house, she explained in a rare, whispered sentence. It was warm, spiced, and comforting, the perfect antidote to the cold rain drumming against the roof. James and Eleanor accepted gratefully, sipping the warm liquid and feeling the chill seep out of their bones. They did not notice the faint, almost imperceptible bitterness that lay beneath the sweetness of the apple and cinnamon. They did not see the way Analyze's gaze lingered on the small, silver cross that hung around Eleanor's neck. They were young, in love, and cocooned in a bubble of their own hopeful future, blind to the predatory darkness that was closing in around them. As they lay on the lump feather bed, Eleanor complained of a stomachache. James, too, felt a strange, unsettling nausea. They dismissed it as a result of their exhaustion and the rich stew. They drifted into a fitful sleep, their dreams troubled by shadows and whispers they couldn't quite place. They would never know that the cider they had so gratefully consumed was laced with the same macabre tincture that had ended Silas Kane's life. The poison was already at work, a serpent coiling in their bellies, slowly, methodically dissolving their future. In the room below, Elias and Annalise sat in silence, listening. They were waiting for the inevitable sounds of sickness to begin, the soft moans that would soon escalate into the final, agonizing symphony that they had conducted so many times before. The tavern was not just a business, it was their abattoir, and the slaughter was about to begin. The disappearance of the Cartwrights was different. Unlike a solitary prospector, they were connected. Their families in Ohio were eagerly awaiting a letter, a sign that they had safely crossed the treacherous Kentucky wilderness. When weeks turned into a month with no word, a knot of fear began to tighten in the hearts of their parents. Letters of inquiry were dispatched, sent to sheriffs and postmasters. Along the Cartwrights' intended route. It was a slow, arduous process in an age of horse and mail coach, a paper trail of desperation inching its way across the country. One of those letters eventually landed on the desk of Sheriff Brody. It was from Alina's father, a man named Thomas Vance, his handwriting shaky, but his words filled with a father's desperate plea. He described his daughter and her new husband, their wagon, their horses. He included a detailed map of their planned journey. The final known leg of their route passed directly through Brody's jurisdiction and directly past the old Finch Tavern. Brody read the letter with a sense of weary duty. Vanishings were common. The frontier was vast, and its appetite for swallowing people whole was insatiable. Still, something about the father's letter, the raw grief palpable in his words, stuck with the sheriff. He made some preliminary, informal inquiries. He spoke to a few local farmers and a traveling preacher. Most had seen nothing. But one old trapper, a man who knew the woods better than his own face, recalled seeing a fine pair of horses, horses that matched Thomas Vance's description, being sold by Elias Finch at a market a month prior. Elias had claimed he'd won them in a card game. The trapper had thought it was odd, as Elias Finch was not a gambling man. This was the first thread. It was thin, circumstantial, but it was enough to pull. It was enough for Sheriff Brody to saddle his horse and ride out to the isolated, forbidding tavern that loomed at the edge of his county, a place that was rapidly shifting in his mind from a local peculiarity to the center of a disturbing and potentially horrifying cold case. Sheriff Brody's arrival at the Traveler's Rest was unannounced. He found Elias Finch splitting firewood behind the tavern, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound breaking the unnerving silence. Elias did not seem surprised to see him. He simply leaned his axe against the woodpile, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand. His eyes were flat, emotionless. Brody dismounted, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. He asked about the Cartwrights, describing them in detail. Elias listened, his expression unchanging. He stroked his thick beard, a gesture of deep contemplation that seemed entirely too practiced. I remember them," he finally rumbled. "A young couple, full of talk about Oregon." He claimed they had stayed a single night, paid their bill with a silver dollar, and left at first light, eager to make good time. He said they were headed west toward the Cumberland Gap. It was a plausible story, delivered with a calm, unwavering conviction. There was no flicker of fear, no hint of deception. Annalise then appeared at the doorway, a wraith in a dark dress. She confirmed her husband's story in a voice that was little more than a dry whisper. She remembered the young woman, she said, because she had been so full of life. The statement was delivered with such a profound lack of emotion that it was more chilling than any lie. Brody asked to see the room where they had stayed. The Finches obliged without hesitation. The room was clean, sterile. The bed was made, the floor swept. There was nothing, not a hairpin, not a stray thread, nothing to suggest the Cartwrights had ever been there. He questioned Elias about the horses. The story was the same as the trappers. He'd won them in a card game from a traveler passing through. He even produced a crudely written bill of sale. It was all too neat, too clean. Brody was an experienced lawman. He knew that true life was messy. The Finch's story was a perfectly constructed wall of denial, and he could find no cracks in it. He left the tavern that day with nothing but a profound sense of disquiet. the feeling that he had just stood face to face with an evil so profound. It had learned to wear the perfect mask of innocence. The visit from the sheriff did not go unnoticed by the Finches. Though they had presented a facade of calm cooperation, Brody's questions were a clear signal that the world outside their isolated kingdom of death was beginning to take notice. The disappearance of the Cartwrights had created a loose thread, one that a persistent man like Sheriff Brody might continue to pull. For the first time, a flicker of what might have been anxiety entered their macabre partnership. They became more cautious. The stream of vanished travelers slowed to a trickle. They turned away potential victims who seemed too well-dressed, too connected, those whose absence might be quickly noted. The tavern became even quieter, sinking deeper into the shadows of the surrounding forest. But Brody could not let it go. The Cartwright case had taken root in his mind. He began a quiet, methodical investigation, digging into the past, sifting through old records and dusty reports from neighboring counties. He was searching for a pattern, and slowly, painstakingly, one began to emerge. He found reports of other missing persons, dating back nearly a decade, all of whom had last been seen traveling the same stretch of road that led past the Finch Tavern. A German immigrant family in 1852, a lone banker carrying bank drafts in 1854, a traveling salesman with a wagon full of wares in 1855. Each was a separate, isolated cold case, a forgotten file gathering dust. But when Brody laid them all out on his desk, they formed a chilling constellation of death, with the traveler's rest at its dark, terrifying center. He was no longer just searching for a missing couple. He was standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into a history of serial murder so prolific and so horrifying that it seemed impossible. How could two people, a simple tavern keeper and his quiet wife, be responsible for so much death, all without leaving a single shred of concrete evidence? The absence of proof was, in itself, the most disturbing clue of all. It spoke of a meticulous, patient, and deeply psychopathic evil. As Sheriff Brody delved deeper into the history of vanishings, he began to understand the true genius of the Finches' horrifying operation. Their choice of victim was paramount, but their method was the key to their longevity. Poison. It was the perfect weapon for their circumstances. A knife or a gun left behind a messy, undeniable crime scene. But poison, especially the sophisticated, home-brewed concoctions Analyze was rumored to create, could perfectly mimic the symptoms of the era's common and deadly illnesses. Cholera, dysentery, food poisoning, swamp fever, all were characterized by violent stomach cramps, vomiting, and a swift, agonizing death. In an age before forensic science, a doctor, if one could even be summoned to such a remote location, would almost certainly misdiagnose the cause of death. The victim would be buried quickly to prevent the spread of disease, and the Finches would be seen not as murderers, but as unfortunate witnesses to the harsh realities of frontier life. This realization sent a chill down Brody's spine. He wasn't just hunting killers. He was hunting artists of death, predators who had turned the very act of murder into a perfectly disguised, natural event. He pictured the scene over and over. A traveler, sick and dying in one of the tavern's upstairs rooms, with Annalise Finch playing the part of the concerned caregiver, perhaps even offering a soothing herbal tea to hasten the end. It was an act of profound, intimate cruelty. To watch your victim suffer, to feign sympathy while knowing you were the cause of their agony, required a level of cold-blooded psychopathy that was almost beyond comprehension. The tavern wasn't just a place of murder. It was a stage, a theater of the macabre where the Finches were the sole actors and the audience, and their unsuspecting guests were the tragic, unwilling stars of the final, horrifying act. The more Brody learned, the more he felt he was losing his grip on the case. He was fighting shadows, trying to prove a series of perfect crimes that had been banned from history by their own terrifying success. The investigation had reached a frustrating impasse. Sheriff Brody had a growing list of names, a disturbing pattern and a powerful gut feeling, but he had no bodies and no proof. The Finches remained untouchable, cocooned in their isolated fortress of denial. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The forest around the tavern burned with the colors of autumn and then slept under a blanket of winter snow. The Cartwright case grew cold, its file joining the others in a testament to the frontier's dark, unsolved mysteries. But the story of the cursed tavern was now more potent than ever. It had evolved from a local whisper to a full-blown legend, a forbidden tale told around campfires across the state. It was said that the Finches had made a pact with the devil, that they sacrificed travelers to a dark entity in the woods in exchange for wealth. Others claimed the ghost of Annalise's mother, a woman rumored to be a witch, haunted the inn, poisoning any who dared to sleep under its roof. These supernatural tales, while terrifying, served to obscure the more grounded, and therefore more horrifying, human truth. If you find these kinds of forbidden histories as compelling as I do, consider subscribing to the channel. Because the truth that was about to be unearthed was far more macabre than any ghost story, and its discovery would hinge not on a lawman's investigation, but on an act of God and the insatiable curiosity of a hound dog. Nature itself, it seemed, was tired of keeping the Finches' disgusting secrets. A storm was brewing on the horizon, one that would not only lash the Kentucky hills with wind and rain, but would also wash away the lies that had protected the traveler's rest for over a decade, exposing the bedrock of horror that lay just beneath the surface. The spring of 1858 arrived with a fury, the heavens penned, and for 3 days and 3 nights, a torrential rain hammered the Kentucky landscape. Creeks swelled into raging rivers, and placid streams became torrents of churning, brown water. The ground, already saturated, could take no more. On the 3rd night, the small creek that snaked along the edge of the Finches' property line broke its banks. The floodwaters surged through the woods, a powerful, liquid bulldozer that reshaped the earth, uprooting trees and stripping away years of accumulated soil and leaf litter. The deluge tore at the soft earth of the creek bank, the very place where Elias Finch had, for years, disposed of his and his wife's grim work. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a scene of devastation and revelation. A local farmer named Jedediah, out hunting for stray livestock with his Bluetick hound, was tracking a scent near the ravaged creek. His dog, usually single-minded in its pursuit of game, suddenly began to whine and dig frantically at a pile of exposed roots and debris. Jedediah, annoyed, went to pull the dog away. But then he saw it. Sticking out of the mud was not a branch or a root, but the unmistakable pallid white of a human tibia. His blood ran cold. He backed away slowly, his eyes scanning the area. And then he saw more. A rib cage tangled in the roots of a sycamore tree. A human skull, its empty sockets staring up at the gray sky, its jaw locked in a silent scream. The flood had performed a horrifying excavation. It had peeled back the skin of the earth to reveal the bone and gristle of the Finches' secret graveyard. Jedediah didn't hesitate. Leaving his dog, he ran, stumbling through the mud and debris, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran all the way to the sheriff's office, his mind reeling with the macabre sight, ready to confirm the darkest, most forbidden legends of the county. Jedediah's breathless, terrified account was the break Sheriff Brody had been waiting for. It was the physical proof, the undeniable truth that had eluded him for so long. He immediately deputized a small posse of the town's most stalwart men, a blacksmith, a doctor, and a handful of farmers who were steady with a rifle and a shovel. They rode out to the tavern at dawn, the mood among them grim and resolute. They found the Finches in the midst of their morning routine, as if it were any other day. Elias was feeding the chickens, Annalise was kneading dough in the kitchen. They showed no surprise, no fear, not even when Brody presented them with a warrant and told them they were to be confined to the tavern while his men conducted a search of the property. Their composure was absolute, almost inhuman. It was as if they were merely spectators at a play, detached from the horrifying events about to unfold. Brody led his men down to the creek bed, to the spot Jedediah had described. The scene was even more gruesome in the stark morning light. The remains were scattered, churned up by the flood, a jigsaw puzzle of human misery. Brody gave the order to start digging. The men set to work, their shovels sinking into the soft, damp earth. The sound was a sickening scrape and thud, a rhythm that would haunt their dreams for years to come. It didn't take long. Just a few feet from the initial discovery, a shovel struck something solid. It wasn't a rock. Carefully, they cleared the dirt away, revealing the contorted skeleton of a man, his limbs bent at unnatural angles. He had been buried in a shallow, unceremonious grave, dumped like so much trash. A few feet away, they found another, and then another. The creek bank was not just a burial site. It was a mass grave, a garden of horrors planted and tended by the silent, watchful couple who were, at that very moment, sitting in their tavern, perhaps sipping tea, waiting for their world to end. The full, horrifying scale of the Finch's crimes was revealed with every shovelful of earth. The posse unearthed 12 complete skeletons from the muddy banks of the creek. 12 souls, stripped of their names, their stories, and their futures, all laid to rest in the Finch's private, Macabre cemetery. But the men suspected this was only a fraction of the true total. The flood had likely washed other remains downstream, while countless more victims could still lie buried deeper in the woods, their gravesites undisturbed, their secrets kept by the silent trees. The victims were a cross-section of the American dream. There was a man buried with a prospector's pick still clutched in his skeletal hand, Sela's cane, no doubt. They found the remains of a man and a woman buried together, a simple gold band still circling her finger bone. The Cartwrights. Near them, a small skeleton, that of a child no older than 10, was found with a tiny, tarnished silver locket. This discovery sent a wave of sickness through the posse. They were not just killing for greed, they were annihilating entire families. Each discovery was more disturbing than the laws. Some bodies had been dismembered, likely to make them easier to transport and bury. Others were found with personal effects, a pocket watch, a set of spectacles, a worn leather-bound Bible, items that gave a heartbreaking glimpse into the lives that had been so cruelly extinguished. Sheriff Brody moved among the gravesites, his face a mask of stone. He was no longer just a lawman. He was an archaeologist of atrocity, unearthing a forbidden history that had been deliberately banned from sight. The air grew heavy, not just with the stench of decay, but with the palpable weight of so much concentrated evil. The legend was no longer a legend. It was a horrifying, quantifiable fact. The Traveler's Rest was not a tavern. It was a human slaughterhouse. With the gruesome evidence laid bare, Sheriff Brody and 2 of his men returned to the tavern. They walked through the front door without knocking. Elias and Annalise were sitting at a table in the common room, a game of checkers set between them, the pieces untouched. They looked up as the men entered, their expressions as placid and unreadable as ever. Elias Finch, Annalise Finch, Brody's voice was low and cold. I am arresting you for the murder of James and Alina Cartwright, and for the murder of the 11 other souls we have just unearthed from your property. There was no reaction, no denial, no protest, no plea for mercy. Elias simply looked at his wife, a silent, imperceptible communication passing between them. He then turned his gaze back to Brody. The game's over then, he said, his voice a flat, deadpan statement of fact. It was not a confession but an acknowledgement. The chilling simplicity of the phrase hung in the air, a testament to their complete and utter lack of remorse. They viewed their years of murder as nothing more than a game, a contest of wits against the world, and now they had simply lost. Annalise remained silent, her pale eyes fixed on Brody. In their depths, he saw not guilt or fear, but a flicker of something that looked like contemptuous curiosity, as if he were an interesting insect she was studying before crushing it under her heel. The posse bound their hands. As they were led out of the tavern, the place they had turned into their personal abattoir, Annalise paused and looked back, her gaze sweeping over the dark, familiar room. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a smile of satisfaction, of a job well done. It was the most horrifying, macabre, and disturbing expression Sheriff Brody had ever seen. It was the smile of a monster who had no regrets, who had enjoyed her work, and who knew her legend was just beginning. The arrest of Elias and Annalise Finch sent shockwaves through the Kentucky frontier. The horrifying discoveries at the tavern became the talk of every town, every trading post, every campfire. The story spread like wildfire, mutating with each telling, growing more lurid and sensational. The official count of 12 victims was quickly inflated by rumor to 20, 30, even 50. The tale of the poisoned tavern was born, a piece of instant, macabre folklore. With the Finches securely locked in the county jail, Sheriff Brody and his men began the grim task of searching the tavern itself. What they found inside was a museum of murder, a curated collection of stolen lives. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom was Sela's Kane's pouch of gold dust, alongside a small, locked chest. When they pried it open, it revealed a treasure trove of grim souvenirs. There were wedding rings, lockets, brooches, pocket watches, and wallets containing yellowed letters and daguerreotypes of stern-faced men and hopeful-looking women, the faces of the dead. It was a catalog of their conquests, but the most disturbing discovery was made in the dark, musty-root cellar. Tucked away on a high shelf behind jars of preserved vegetables were dozens of small, corked vials. Some were empty, others half full of a dark, viscous liquid. Dr. Adams, the town physician who had accompanied the posse, uncorked one and sniffed it cautiously. He recognized the faint, almond-like scent of arsenic, but there was something else, a complex herbal aroma he couldn't place. This was Annalise's laboratory. This was where she practiced her dark alchemy, brewing the potions that had sent so many unsuspecting travelers to their agonizing deaths. Each vial was a testament to her patient, methodical cruelty. The search confirmed what Brody already knew. These were not crimes of passion. This was a cold, calculated, and long-running enterprise of murder for profit, executed with a level of precision that was utterly terrifying. The presence of the poison vials added a new, even more sinister dimension to the case. Dr. Adams took several samples back to his small office for a more thorough examination. His tools were primitive by modern standards, but he was a knowledgeable man, well-versed in both medicine and botany. He confirmed the presence of a significant quantity of arsenic, a common and easily obtainable rat poison, but mixed with it, he identified the telltale alkaloids of Atropa belladonna, commonly known as deadly nightshade, and traces of aconitum or wolfsbane. It was a truly diabolical cocktail. Arsenic alone would kill, but it was slow and its symptoms could be ambiguous. The nightshade would cause delirium, hallucinations, and a rapid, fluttering heartbeat. The wolfsbane would attack the nervous system, causing excruciating muscular pain, paralysis, and finally, cardiac arrest. Annalise had not just created a poison. She had orchestrated an experience of pure, unadulterated agony. Dr. Adams explained to Sheriff Brody that the combination of these substances would produce a horrifying but confusing array of symptoms. The victim would experience intense gastrointestinal distress from the arsenic, the terrifying hallucinations of nightshade, and the paralyzing, burning pain of wolfsbane all at once. To an observer, it would look like a sudden, violent, and inexplicable illness, a brain fever or a demonic possession, as some might have called it. It was a poison designed not just to kill, but to mask itself, to create a spectacle of suffering so chaotic that no one would ever suspect the quiet, unassuming woman who served them their last drink. Annalise Finch was not merely a killer. She was a folk chemist, a necromancer of the natural world, using her intimate knowledge of the forest's darkest secrets to fuel her and her husband's horrifying greed. The level of premeditation, the sheer, cold-hearted sadism of it, was almost impossible for a sane mind to process. In the county jail, Elias and Annalise Finch remained an enigma. They were housed in separate cells, yet they seemed to operate with a single, unified mind. They refused to speak to anyone, not to Sheriff Brody, not to the preacher who offered them solace, not to the court-appointed lawyer who tried to build a defense. They simply sat in silence, their composure unnervingly intact. Elias would stare at the stone wall for hours, placid and unmoving. Annalise would sit on her cot, her hands folded in her lap, her pale eyes following the movements of the guards with a detached, analytical curiosity. Their silence was more damning than any confession. It was the silence of those who have no defense to offer because they believe they have done nothing wrong. In their twisted worldview, their victims were not people. They were resources, like deer to be hunted or crops to be harvested. There was no room for morality or remorse in their grim calculus of survival and profit. As the date for their trial approached, the public's fascination with the case reached a fever pitch. People traveled from all over the state, hoping to catch a glimpse of the poisoning finches, the demons of the backwoods. The story of their crimes had become a national sensation, a horrifying morality play for a country fascinated by the darkness that lurked on the edges of its own expansion. But as the trial began, it became clear there would be no dramatic courtroom confessions, no tearful pleas for forgiveness. The Finches remained silent. The prosecution, led by a fire-breathing circuit judge, laid out the mountain of evidence: the bodies, the stolen trinkets, the vials of poison. It was an open and shut case. The defense lawyer, having received no cooperation from his clients, could do little more than weakly suggest the evidence was circumstantial. The jury, a panel of grim-faced farmers and merchants, listened with a mixture of horror and revulsion. They did not need to hear a confession. The truth was written on the stony, remorseless faces of the two accused monsters sitting before them. The trial of Elias and Annalise Finch was swift. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a verdict: guilty. Guilty on 12 counts of murder in the first degree. The sentence was mandatory and absolute: death by hanging. When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in a wave of grim satisfaction. But the Finches themselves displayed no emotion. Elias stared straight ahead, his jaw set. Annalise, if anything, seemed faintly bored by the proceedings. They had accepted their fate with the same cold detachment with which they had lived their lives and committed their crimes. On the day of the execution, a massive crowd gathered in the town square. It was a morbid, carnival-like atmosphere. Families brought picnic baskets. Vendors sold roasted peanuts and lemonade. It was a public spectacle, a communal purging of the evil that had festered in their midst for so long. Elias was the first to ascend the gallows. His final words were not of remorse, but of cold, simple pragmatism. "I'd have killed more if I'd had the time," he reportedly muttered to the hangman, a final, unrepentant boast. When it was Annalise's turn, a hush fell over the crowd. She walked to the noose with that same unnerving, spectral grace she had displayed in her tavern. Her face was pale, her expression serene. The hangman asked if she had any last words. She looked out over the sea of faces, her pale eyes seeming to meet every gaze at once, and for the first and only time since her arrest, she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper, but a clear, chillingly calm statement. "You bury us deep," she said, "but the weeds that grow from our graves will be poison, and the water in the creek will be bitter. You haven't ended anything. You have only planted us." It was not a confession. It was a curse. A final, macabre promise that their evil would linger, seeping into the very soil of the land they had terrorized. Annalise Finch's final, chilling words proved to be prophetic. In the aftermath of the executions, a palpable sense of dread lingered over the county. The townsfolk had excised the cancer, but the fear of metastasis remained. By order of the circuit judge, the Travelers' Rest Tavern was to be banned from existence, erased from the landscape as a monument to its own depravity. A controlled fire was set, and the community gathered to watch the structure that had housed so much death be consumed by flames. They watched as the roof collapsed, as the log walls turned to charcoal, as the sign bearing the tavern's ironically welcoming name curled into ash. They hoped that the fire would purify the land, that it would cauterize the wound the Finches had inflicted upon their community. But it was not that simple. Evil, once it takes root, is not so easily burned away. The story of the poisoned tavern became a permanent stain on the region's history. The road past the ruins was largely abandoned, with travelers preferring to take a longer, safer route than to pass by the cursed ground. The land itself became a place of morbid pilgrimage and dark legend. Locals claimed that on moonless nights, you could see strange lights dancing among the ruins, or hear the faint, disembodied voice of a woman humming a lullaby. They said the plants that grew on the property were twisted and strange, and that animals gave the area a wide berth. The creek where the bodies were found became known as Poison Creek, and it was said that its water would sicken any who drank from it. Analyze's curse, whether supernatural or simply a powerful, psychologically implanted suggestion, had worked. The Finches were dead, but their reign of terror continued, transformed from a physical threat into a psychological one. They had become the monsters in a real-life fairy tale, the ultimate cautionary story of the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly ordinary facade. One of the most disturbing and persistent questions that lingered long after the Finches were gone was the true number of their victims. The official count, the number for which they were tried and executed, was 12. This number was based solely on the skeletons that the flood had dislodged and the posse had managed to recover from the creek bank. But everyone, from Sheriff Brody to the most hardened cynic in the county, knew that number was tragically, horrifyingly low. Brody himself, in his private journals, speculated that the Finches' killing spree had likely lasted for the better part of 15 years. He based this on the timeline of the earliest missing person reports he had uncovered that fit their pattern. If they had maintained a modest average of just 3 to 4 victims per year, a conservative estimate, the true total could easily have been upwards of 50 or 60 people. Where were the other bodies? It was a question that haunted the region for generations. Some were likely washed away by the flood, their bones scattered for miles downriver, never to be recovered. But it was widely believed that the creek bank was not their only graveyard. Elias Finch was a strong, methodical man. It was entirely plausible that dozens more graves lay scattered throughout the dense, unforgiving woods that surrounded the tavern property. Secret, unmarked plots, their locations known only to the two monsters who had dug them. This possibility transformed the entire forest into a potential crime scene, a vast, unhallowed burial ground. Every hunter who stumbled upon a strange depression in the earth, every farmer who plowed up a bone in a new field, was faced with the same chilling thought. Is this another one? The uncertainty was, in some ways, worse than the known horror. It meant the case was never truly closed. The full story of the Traveler's Rest was never fully told, because the final, gruesome chapter remained buried, scattered in the cold, dark earth of the Kentucky hills, a permanent and unsolved legacy of the macabre. The legend of the Poison Tavern became a carefully guarded, almost forbidden piece of local history. While the sensationalized account spread far and wide, the community that had lived through the terror often refused to speak of it. It was a collective trauma, a wound so deep that they preferred to cover it with a scar of silence rather than risk reopening it. The names of the 12 identified victims were recorded, but the dozens of others, the shadow victims, remained nameless, faceless statistics in a story that had already passed into the realm of folklore. This desire to forget, to move on, was a form of self-preservation. But it also had an unintended consequence. The methodical, calculated evil of the Finches was, in some ways, downplayed. The folklore focused on the supernatural, the curses, the ghosts, the devil pacts. These were easier concepts to grapple with than the horrifyingly simple human truth that two seemingly ordinary people were capable of such extraordinary, systematic cruelty for something as mundane as money. The real horror of the Finch case was not in its supposed supernatural elements, but in its profound and disturbing humanity. It served as a terrifying reminder of the banality of evil, the concept that the most monstrous acts are often committed not by cackling, cartoonish villains, but by quiet, unassuming people who have methodically detached themselves from all moral and empathetic considerations. Elias and Annalise Finch were not goblins or demons. They were a husband and wife who ran a small business, and their business was murder. This truth is far more unsettling than any ghost story, because it implies that such darkness could be hiding anywhere, behind any friendly smile, in any welcoming home. This is the true curse of the traveler's rest, the knowledge that the greatest monsters are not those that lurk in the shadows of our imagination, but those who walk among us in the broad light of day. The story of the Finches serves as a macabre historical bookmark, a case study in the vulnerabilities of a society in transition. The American frontier of the 1850s was a place that existed in a state of near lawlessness. Civilization was a thin veneer, easily scratched away to reveal the primal brutality underneath. Law enforcement was sparse, communication was slow, and forensic science was non-existent. It was a perfect environment for predators like Elias and Analyze to thrive. They exploited the system's weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. They understood that the constant churn of migration created a steady supply of anonymous, transient victims. They knew that the vastness of the wilderness was the perfect accomplice, an enormous canvas on which to hide their crimes. Their reign of terror could likely not have lasted so long in a more settled, more interconnected place. They were a product of their specific time and location, a dark symbiosis of human evil and environmental opportunity. The case also highlights the critical role of chance in the administration of justice. For over a decade, the Finches committed perfect crimes. It was not brilliant detective work or a clever investigation that finally brought them down. It was a rainstorm, a random, unpredictable act of nature that did what no lawman had been able to do. It uncovered the truth. Without that flood, it is entirely possible that the Finches could have continued their horrifying enterprise for another decade, adding dozens more to their silent, secret graveyards. They might have simply grown old and died in their beds, taking the full, horrifying scope of their crimes with them to the grave. It's a chilling thought. The idea that justice is not always inevitable, that it can be subject to the whims of weather and luck, is a deeply unsettling one. It suggests that for every monster like the Finches that is caught, there may be others who were luckier, whose secrets remain safely buried, their stories forever lost to time. What drove them? It is the question that lies at the heart of the Finch Tavern legend. For Elias, the motive seems brutally straightforward: greed. He was a man of simple, avaricious appetites. The stolen goods, the gold dust, the horses, these were the tangible rewards of his grim work. He was the brute force, the one who dug the graves and disposed of the evidence. His final words on the gallows, a boast about killing more, speak to a man who saw murder as a trade, a shortcut to the prosperity he was unwilling to earn through honest labor. But Analyze is a far more complex and terrifying figure. While she certainly benefited from the profits, her motivations seemed to run deeper into darker, more psychological waters. Her meticulous creation of the poisons, the almost artistic flair with which she combined them to create a specific, agonizing experience for her victims, suggests something beyond mere greed. It suggests a fascination with the process itself. It suggests a desire for power and control. In a time when women had very little agency, Analyze in her isolated kingdom held the ultimate power, the power of life and death. She was the quiet, unassuming G-woman to whom powerful men and hopeful families came for comfort, and she, with a few colorless drops, could bring them to their knees. There was a profound, psychopathic God complex at play. She may not have just been killing for a pocket watch. She may have been killing for the thrill of the act itself, for the intimate, absolute dominance she held over her victims in their final, terrifying moments. She was the true artist of the partnership, the cold, calculating mind behind the brawn. Elias may have been the hangman, but Analyze was the architect of their entire horrifying enterprise. It is her specter, the quiet, graceful poisoner, that truly haunts the legend of the traveler's rest. The legacy of the Finch Tavern case extends beyond the local folklore. It serves as a chilling precursor to a uniquely American brand of horror, the murder house, or killer inn. The story of the unsuspecting traveler falling into a trap laid by seemingly hospitable hosts would become a recurring motif in the nation's dark folklore, and eventually, its popular culture. Long before H. Holmes built his infamous Murder Castle in Chicago, or the Bloody Benders turned their Kansas Inn into a charnel house, Elias and Annalise Finch were perfecting the craft in the backwoods of Kentucky. They were pioneers of a particularly insidious form of serial murder, one that weaponized the very concept of trust and hospitality. A traveler's inn is supposed to be a sanctuary, a safe harbor in a dangerous world. The Finches twisted this sacred trust into its horrifying opposite. They created a place where the promise of safety was the lure, and the offer of comfort was the prelude to death. This perversion of hospitality is what makes their story so deeply disturbing. It taps into a primal fear, that the hand that offers you a warm drink might also be the one that delivers your doom. It's a betrayal of the most basic social contract. If you enjoy digging into these dark histories that expose the roots of modern fears, I invite you to join our community by subscribing. The historical cold cases we explore often reveal that the horrors we see in fiction have very real, and often far more macabre, origins. The Finches were not just characters in a ghost story. They were a real-world blueprint for some of America's most infamous monsters, proving that the deadliest traps are often the ones we walk into willingly, lured by the promise of a warm fire and a friendly face. The tale of the Traveler's Rest also offers a dark commentary on the nature of memory and history. What is remembered and what is allowed to be forgotten? In the immediate aftermath, the community's response was to erase the physical evidence of the Finches' crimes. They burned the tavern, hoping to obliterate its history. In the years that followed, the official records of the trial and the investigation, while preserved, were not widely publicized. The story was relegated to the realm of oral tradition, of folklore. This was a conscious, communal act of suppression. The truth was simply too ugly, too traumatic to be integrated into the official, optimistic narrative of westward expansion and frontier bravery. It was a story that was, in a very real sense, banned from polite conversation and formal history. But evil has a way of refusing to be forgotten. The story survived, not in history books but in whispers. It became a ghost story told to frighten children, a local legend that tourists might hear about from a grizzled old-timer. This transformation from historical fact to folklore served a purpose. It softened the edges of the horror. It made the story safer. A ghost is a terrifying but ultimately supernatural concept. Two ordinary people who systematically poisoned dozens of men, women, and children for profit is a far more immediate and disturbing reality. The legend of the poisoned tavern is therefore a paradox. It is both a product of historical memory and a product of historical amnesia. It remembers the horror, but it forgets the deeply unsettling, mundane humanity of the monsters who perpetrated it. It's a reminder that sometimes, the stories we tell ourselves about the past are designed not just to remember, but to protect us from the full, unbearable weight of the truth. One detail of the Finch case that is often lost in the more sensational aspects of the legend is the fate of their possessions. After the tavern was burned and the Finches were executed, the county held an auction to sell off their remaining property, the land itself, their farm equipment, and the contents of the tavern that had not been seized as evidence. It was a morbid affair, with curiosity seekers and bargain hunters picking through the mundane remnants of a monstrous life. People bought their chairs, their tables, their pots and pans, but no one wanted the small, personal items, and no one, absolutely no one, bid on the collection of dozens of stolen trinkets that had been found in the floorboards, the lockets, rings, and watches of the dead. These items were considered cursed, tainted by their gruesome history. They were objects saturated with the pain and terror of their original owner's final moments. The sheriff, not knowing what else to do with this collection of grim artifacts, had them placed in a wooden box and stored in the evidence room of the county courthouse. For years, the box sat on a dusty shelf, a silent, tragic memorial to the forgotten victims. According to local legend, the box itself became a source of unease. Clerks working late at night reported hearing faint whispers coming from the evidence room, Others claim to feel a profound and inexplicable sadness when handling the box. Eventually, sometime in the early 20th century, the box simply vanished. Some say a fire destroyed that wing of the courthouse. Others whisper that a later sheriff, tired of the object's dark reputation, had it quietly removed and buried in an unmarked grave, giving the final possessions of the victims the anonymous burial that the Finches had given them. The lost box of trinkets remains one of the case's most haunting, unresolved mysteries, a collection of stolen memories, vanished twice over. The psychological profile of Annalise Finch remains one of the most chilling aspects of the entire affair. In the annals of crime, she represents a particularly terrifying archetype, the female poisoner. Historically, poison has often been stereotyped as a woman's weapon, a cliché rooted in misogynistic ideas about physical weakness and cunning deception. But Annalise was no mere stereotype. She was a master of her craft, a cold, patient, and highly intelligent killer who operated in a sphere of domesticity. Her kitchen was not a place of nourishment, but a laboratory of death. Her specialty of the house was not spiced cider, but a meticulously crafted elixir of agony. This perversion of the domestic sphere is profoundly unsettling. She weaponized the very acts of care and hospitality. Her victims died because they trusted her. They accepted a meal, a drink, a gesture of kindness, and in doing so, they sealed their own fate. This method allowed her to kill without overt violence, to maintain a facade of delicate femininity while engaging in acts of unimaginable brutality. Was she a victim herself, coerced by a domineering husband? The evidence suggests the opposite. Her serene composure, her final curse, and the sheer scientific sophistication of her poisons all point to a woman who was, at the very least, an equal partner in the enterprise and, more likely, its driving creative force. Elias was the muscle, the gravedigger, but Annalise was the soul of their operation, a black, twisted, and utterly remorseless soul. She represents a form of evil that is quiet, insidious, and all the more terrifying for the way it hides in plain sight, concealed behind the mask of the ordinary, the domestic, and the mundane. Her story is a disturbing exploration of the darkness that can fester within the supposed safety of the home. The story of the Traveler's Rest has, over the decades, become a fixture of Kentucky's dark tourism. The site where the tavern once stood is now just a clearing in the woods, the foundation stones barely visible beneath a century and a half of moss and leaf litter. There is no sign, no memorial. The land is privately owned, and the owners do not encourage visitors. Yet, people still seek it out. Ghost hunters, amateur historians, and those with a taste for the macabre make quiet pilgrimages to the spot, hoping to feel a chill, to capture a strange light on camera, to connect with the terrifying history of the place. They search the woods for depressions in the earth that might mark one of the undiscovered graves. They pan for trinkets in Poison Creek, hoping to find a lost button or a tarnished coin from one of the victims. This modern fascination speaks to the story's enduring power. We are drawn to such places not just for a cheap thrill, but because they represent a tangible connection to the darkest aspects of human nature. Standing in that silent clearing, it is possible to feel the immense weight of the past, to imagine the terror of the traveler arriving at dusk, seeing the welcoming light of the tavern, and feeling a sense of profound relief, entirely unaware that they are stepping out of the wilderness and into a far more dangerous, man-made trap. The site itself has become a sort of monument, not one built of stone or bronze, but one constructed of fear, legend, and memory. It is a place that reminds us that the most horrifying stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones that really happened. The soil itself seems to hold the memory of the atrocities committed there, a permanent, invisible stain that no amount of time can ever truly wash away. Could a crime like the Finches happen today? It is a natural question to ask when confronted with such a historical horror. In own ways, the answer is obviously no. A modern traveler is not so isolated. Our world is woven together by a web of technology and surveillance that would make the Finch's brand of serial disappearance nearly impossible to sustain. We leave a constant digital trail: cell phone pings, credit card transactions, social media check-ins. A missing persons case that might have taken months to even be noticed in 1856 would now trigger an Amber Alert in minutes. Forensic science, too, has evolved beyond recognition. Analyzes sophisticated poison, so effective at mimicking natural disease in her time, would be instantly identifiable in a modern toxicology report. The cause of death would not be a mystery. The pattern of victims would be flagged by law enforcement databases in a matter of weeks. The Finch's great advantages, isolation, anonymity, and the primitive state of investigative science, have been largely eroded by the passage of time. But this conclusion is deceptively comforting. While the method of the Finch's crimes belongs to a bygone era, the motive and the mindset are timeless. Greed, psychopathy, and a chilling lack of empathy are not artifacts of the 19th century. The human capacity for monstrous behavior has not changed. The desire to exploit the vulnerable for personal gain remains a constant. The monsters of today may use different tools and operate in different environments: the internet, financial markets, complex social networks, but they are still monsters. The story of the Traveler's Rest is not just a relic of a more brutal past. It is a permanent, chilling reminder that the darkness the Finches embodied is an ever-present part of the human condition, always waiting for the right combination of opportunity and moral failure to manifest itself anew. Let us return for a moment to analyze his curse. The weeds that grow from our graves will be poison, and the water in the creek will be bitter. Was it merely the final, defiant threat of a condemned woman, or was there something more to it? In the years following the executions, a strange phenomenon was reported. The local flora around the tavern site and near the Finch's unmarked graves in the Potter's Field began to change. According to local accounts, the area saw an unusual proliferation of toxic plants. Nightshade, wolfsbane, and poison hemlock, the very ingredients of Analyze's trade, were said to grow in unnatural abundance, choking out the native wildflowers and grasses. It was as if the land itself was producing a living tribute to her dark arts. Scientists and botanists would dismiss this as coincidence, a quirk of soil pH or seed distribution. But to the local population, it was proof. It was the fulfillment of her prophecy. It was a sign that her evil was so profound. It had literally seeped into the ground, poisoning the earth itself and turning it into a reflection of her own twisted soul. This belief, whether based in fact or folklore, became a powerful part of the legend. It cemented the idea that the land was permanently tainted, cursed. People avoided hunting in those woods, believing the meat of any animal that grazed there would be toxic. They refused to draw water from Poison Creek, even decades after the events. Analyze's final words achieved what the fire and the executions could not. They ensured that her legacy of fear would be permanent. She had managed one final, brilliant act of psychological terrorism, transforming a patch of ordinary Kentucky woodland into a place of perpetual, macabre dread, forever banned by fear and superstition. Her body was in the ground, but her poison lived on. The final, unresolved horror of the Traveler's Rest lies not in the number of the dead, but in the number of the unknown. Of the 12 skeletons recovered, only the Cartwrights were ever positively identified. The others were buried in the town cemetery under simple wooden markers that read "Known only to God." Silas Kane was presumed to be among them, but it was never confirmed. Who were they? What were their stories, their hopes, their dreams? They were not just victims, they were people. A father, perhaps, carrying a gift for a child he would never see again. A young man running from a troubled past, hoping for a fresh start in the West. A widow traveling to live with her only remaining family. We will never know. Their identities were the final thing the Finches stole from them, an act of erasure more complete than death itself. Their stories ended abruptly and anonymously in a squalid tavern room, their final moments a blur of poison-induced agony and terror. This anonymity is the case's deepest tragedy. It transforms the victims from individuals into a collective, a ghostly chorus of the vanished. It is their silent, unknown faces that haunt the ruins of the tavern. It is their forgotten names that are whispered on the wind that blows through Poison Creek. The Finch Tavern case is, therefore, a cold case that can never truly be solved. We know the killers, we know their method, and we know their motive. But we will never know the full extent of their crimes, because the vast majority of their victims remain lost to history, their disappearances noted only in the cold, remorseless ledger of their murderers' minds. They are permanent ghosts, forever tied to the cursed ground where their journeys so brutally and senselessly ended. In the end, the story of Elias and Annalise Finch is a story about a void. It is about the vast, empty spaces on the frontier map and the moral void that can open within the human heart. They operated in a vacuum of law, of communication, and ultimately of empathy. They looked at their fellow human beings and saw not souls, but obstacles. They saw not lives, but collections of trinkets to be harvested. This complete and utter failure of humanity is the core of their evil. The tavern itself, now gone for over a century, has become a symbol of this void. The clearing in the woods is a scar on the landscape, a reminder of the darkness that once filled that space. The legend is what we, as humans, have built around that void to try and make sense of it. We tell stories of curses and ghosts because the reality of the Finch's cold, calculating, and mundane evil is almost too much to bear. We need the story to have a supernatural element because it allows us to distance ourselves from the horrifying knowledge that these monsters were not creatures from another world. They were people just like us. They were a husband and a wife. They ran a business. They slept in a bed and ate at a table. And in between these moments of ordinary life, they committed acts of extraordinary depravity. That is the final, chilling lesson of the traveler's rest. It is a story that forces us to look into the abyss and to recognize that the abyss is not in some far-off, fantastical realm of demons and spirits. The abyss is right here, inside of us, a dark potential that history warns us to never, ever forget. The soil in that part of Kentucky keeps its secrets well. Even today, the full truth of what happened at the Traveler's Rest remains buried, both literally and figuratively. How many more bodies lie waiting in the dark, silent earth of those woods? Was there a secret ledger, a list of names that was burned with the tavern? Did the Finches have accomplices, or a hidden network for selling their stolen goods, who took their secrets to the grave? These are questions without answers, loose threads in a story that will forever remain incomplete. The tale has now passed from history into the realm of pure legend, a campfire story that has become one of America's most disturbing and foundational tales of macabre horror. The names Elias and Annalise Finch are rarely spoken, but the specter of the Poison Tavern lingers, a testament to their enduring, terrifying legacy. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the path to a new life can sometimes lead to a dead end, that a welcoming light in the distance can be a lure into eternal darkness, and that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones who greet you with a smile and offer you a place to rest. They are a warning, whispered from the past, that for some unfortunate travelers, the price of a single drink can be everything they have and everything they will ever be. The case is closed, but the horror, like a potent, slow-acting poison, remains.